This is really just an update on the natural history of snakes, lizards, and tortoises that I've been working on with my students for the last 30 years in a number of the mountain preserves. So here's a myth that, again, you'll say, I never thought that. Why is Sullivan suggesting we did? But it's just to point out that having set up the Phoenix Mountain Preserve some 50 some odd years ago and added preserves over the years, that we might have imagined this was all well and good and everything was fine and dandy, that we're putting aside habitat. But of course, as you know from the name Mountain Preserve, it was only one kind of habitat that was set aside, and especially from a herp perspective, amphibians and reptiles, we weren't putting aside flats and washes. Okay? Those are two very important habitats. When we think of herps in desert environments, herpetologists anyway, generally think of the world in these three ways: slopes, flats, and washes. So we can ask the question, were those original Phoenix Mountain Preserves adequate to protect and preserve the herpetofaunal elements? Now, one of those primary ones, or at least it's a very obvious one that most folks that have been to the mountain preserves know about, are chuckwallas. Large lizards that are rock-dwelling specialists. They're plant eaters, which is unusual for lizards. And we have them right here in this mountain preserve, as well as many others. And Phoenix is a very special place because three different kinds of chuckwallas, the three known primary color morphs in North America, converge in the Phoenix area. If you're familiar with the Phoenix Mountains, and this is what I say, I don't know that you can even see the label up there, Lookout Mountain, with the lighting issues. But in any case, here in the Phoenix Mountains, North Mountain, Lookout Mountain, Shadow Mountain, and the rest, we have what's called the tricolor morph, red, white, and black. South Mountain, though, if you know, they used to, in fact, the parks folks would sell t-shirts at the South Mountain Visitor Center. I don't know if they still do that. 15, 20 years ago they did. That was advertising the South Mountain Chuckwalla. If you can see that fellow there with the bright carrot orange tail. The South Mountain Range is the only known occurrence of this color morph of chuckwallas. It's protected by the state as a result. And then to the south of the Gila River, we have the other, what's called bicolor morph. Instead of an orange tail, it's back to the yellow-white tail, but a solid black body. My students and I initially set out to look at the significance of these color morphs for behavioral ecology, but I'm not going to talk about that today. If you're interested in it, you can ask me about it later. It did give us the opportunity to see how chuckwallas were doing in Phoenix Mountain Preserves. In the mid-90s, we surveyed 8 mountain preserve sites, and then we surveyed them again a few years back. Turns out that you can just count fecal pellets. Chuckwallas make very conspicuous fecal droppings in the rocky areas where they bask, and you can count those up. What we did across those 2 survey periods was to simply assess the fecal counts in the preserved sites, and we found that they were highly correlated. It did not appear that the chuckwalla populations were in any way, shape, or form declining across our survey period. And in fact, at one site, we captured 40% of the animals we'd marked 15, 16, 17 years before, which was really a surprise to us. Right here at Lookout Mountain Preserve, if you can see that, I hope at least vaguely make it out. That's just across the street, up the road here a bit, less than a couple of kilometers from where we're sitting right here today. The houses there are on the left side, 12th Street, if you know the area, and that's an aerial photo of the western half of Lookout Mountain, what we call West Ridge. That little red circle, it's about 20 meters across. This female was found in that red circle in 1995 when she was a normal adult average-sized female, about 6 inches in snout vent length. That's the typical measure for a lizard's body size. She was found within 20 meters of that exact crevice 16 years later. And she had grown roughly 1 millimeter a year, which was a nice confirmation of the growth rate we had predicted for chuckwallas in another paper we'd done a couple of decades before. So it was nice to get that corroboration, but even more exciting was the fact that it suggested chuckwallas live, in her case, she's minimally 25 years old between these 2 sampling periods, and putting together what her adolescence looked like, if we can hypothesize about that. But it suggests that really large male chuckwallas and large females may be upwards to 30, possibly even 40 years of age, not something we expect for a lizard. Back to the chuckwallas in the mountain preserve, what we were able to conclude from these surveys is they are doing fine. If we had decided that the Phoenix Mountain Preserve system was put in place to preserve chuckwallas, we could all pat ourselves on the back and say we've done a great job. They're in every preserve still today. one of the things about them is, as herbivores, they have a very high preferred body temperature. This is required for digesting plant products, which are a difficult thing for lizards to do. And this may allow them to weather things like urban heat island effects that we know are affecting the Phoenix area preserves, or global warming to come. But in any case, we can safely conclude that populations are persisting. What of the other lizards? Well, we added some additional mountain preserve sites, and we also added some flood control sites to the north of us here along Skunk Creek and Cave Creek that have flats. And by definition, what good is a flood control site if it doesn't have a wash? So they have washes as well, to see if we could pick up some of the lizards that we expected to be in those kinds of habitats. And we used a variety of survey methods to do this, both in the 90s and then again more recently. And gosh, another tough one, but in any case, if you can make out that's an aerial depiction of the Phoenix area and those red outlines are the preserves, we're there in the center, right? So we're sitting right there right now. There's South Mountain. There's Cave Buttes up at the north end, one of the flood control sites that I mentioned. And you can see, I hope, that it's outside of the urban sprawl and that there is an area of what appears to be open desert flats. Take my word for it. These are the sorts of lizards that we were looking for. And again, these slides won't show up too well, but we'll make do. Oh, I knew that was going to happen. Desert iguanas on the upper left, zebra-tailed lizards on the right, horned lizards. These were the sorts of lizards that we were worried about, given that they are, by herpetologists' accounts, flat land dwelling lizards. This is an especially a nice one of this group, the regal horned lizard. And again, you might not be able to make it out, but it's sitting at a seed harvester ant nest. And on the lower right, it's got its large, fleshy, mucus-coated tongue grabbing a seed harvester ant so that it can inhale that. There is one. Thank you very much. Very good. Whoop. All right. There is a female. She's panting on a hot summer day. Not as good as our dogs are, but they will pant when overheated. In any case, we surveyed the preserves and compared them to outlying larger areas like the McDowell Mountain Park, White Tanks Park, Sierra Estrella Park. Those numbers in the white squares are the diversity of lizards that we detected. So what can we see? First off, little preserves, like Lookout Mountain, have a low diversity of lizards. And this is probably just a result of a low diversity of habitats, nothing but slopes. Larger preserves, like South Mountain there at the bottom, have higher diversity because of the fact that they're larger and they contain a larger array of habitats as a consequence. Nonetheless, even the largest preserves are less than the very large outlying areas. Again, that might be simply a size relationship. We didn't look at that in detail. But it might also be that there are some lizards that come in to central Arizona from different parts of the country, if you will, and they simply drop out by the time they get to Phoenix. We'll talk more about that shortly. So, what were our results with these other lizards? The regal horned lizard we found was present in Piestewa Peak in the 1990s, and it was absent more recently. This was the one loss of a species that we experienced. Desert iguanas, one of those flatland lizards, wasn't in the interior preserves. We didn't find it. So, larger preserves had higher diversity. Some, but not all, flatland species were detected at those flood control sites. Okay, so let's take up what was the loss of the horned lizards about. When we were first going to the Piestewa Peak Preserve, we found seed harvester ant nests there in the 1990s. When we returned in 2010, those ant nests were vacant. They were no longer occupied. It appears that for whatever reason, we don't know why, the seed harvester ants have declined. And it may be that the horned lizards have declined as a result of that, an indirect loss, as opposed to something direct like we collected them or we killed them or whatever it might be. But we don't know. We simply know that they are gone. That's the one lizard species that we know had been present historically and is no longer present. That's a little shot of the 40th Street area of Piestewa Peak, if you recognize it coming in from the north side there, where there is an area of flats. Now, unfortunately, with all of these abbreviations and such, it's a difficult table to to take in. I'll lead you through it, but these are the 4 sites that were surveyed most intensively. Adobe Dam and Cave Buttes are the flood control sites. Lookout, the smallest preserve. South, the largest mountain preserve. What you can see for one is if you just see there's abbreviations for lizard names on the left-hand side there, and you scroll across to South Mountain, you see, well, there's that higher diversity. Most of those lizards are represented there. But look at Lookout. Only 3 species found there, very low diversity. It simply doesn't have the spatial habitat variation to encompass those lizards. Look then at the 2 flood control sites, Adobe Dam and Cave Buttes. They have a bit more diversity, but not all. It wasn't all that we expected. We were hoping to pick up more. So what's going on there? So this is just a little summation to this point. We've gotten through quite a bit of data. South Mountain, higher diversity than Lookout Mountain. And the reason why I'm being somewhat flippant with these results, this is classic what's called island biogeographic theory. Small areas, low diversity, large areas, higher diversity. And it's just thought to be a habitat space relationship. Okay, the flood control sites that I just said, they added some species, but not all. And then one of these little ecological truisms, if you saw those numbers, we'll see them again shortly here. A few species were very common, some species were very rare. That's sort of a generalized trend. In most communities, a particular set of species of some kind, lizards, beetles, whatever, a few species are common and most species are rare. Now, again, these don't show up all that well, but the horned lizard on the left, desert spiny lizard, Chuckwalla there, the lower left, that's South Mountain in the center. These are the species at South Mountain. Side-blotched lizards, desert iguanas, tree lizards coming around to the right, a zebra tail, and then that's a tiger whiptail. Here's Lookout. Only 3 of those represented for all intents and purposes. Chuckwallas on the lower right, there's a tiger whiptail in the center, and the ubiquitous ever-present side-blotched lizard on the left. This then just focuses on the top 5 lizard species. Notice again, we only have 3 of those at Lookout. We have all of them at South Mountain. SBL, side-blotched lizard. Small brown lizard, I guess, if you follow what ornithologists do, but in any case, it is a typical small lizard. Whiptail lizard, notice it's number 2. So look at that. The flood control sites, which in a moment I'll make the case, probably represent what most of the valley looked like. Most of the valley was flats. We preserved the mountains. If you calculated the total area of urban sprawl, probably 90 to 95% of it is now occupying what was flats. And look at that, Cave Buttes and Adobe Dam. What's the dominant lizard? The side-blotched lizard. Keep that in the back of your mind. Plus tiger whiptails, the 2 of them, they account for 80 to 90% of the lizards that you would see. Okay? The other lizards are relatively rare, except South Mountain, which is a uniquely diverse habitat for a variety of organisms, including plants, for those of you that know it. Now, this table is back to the original one with those lower 2 highlighted. The tree lizard, which you all know. Everyone nod along. You know the tree lizard. Why do you know the tree lizard? It's the lizard on your block wall. I assume most of you, like me, have a block wall, and you've seen a lizard on it during the day. It's a tree lizard. Look at that. Thousands of side-blotched lizards at Cave Buttes. Not a single tree lizard. South Mountain has them, but that's because South Mountain is special, as we'll talk about. And then the desert iguana, zeros, zeros, zeros at Lookout, of course, but 1 at South Mountain. So let's talk about those more. There's the desert iguana on the left, the big flatland-dwelling lizard I've been speaking of, and the tree lizard that lives like you think it should, in trees or surrogates, walls, or big boulder fields. It's a vertical habitat specialist, true to its name. Okay? But that should be something that you recognize as the lizard in your yard. We'll get back to it in a moment. Cave Buttes, large area of flats. We had expected to pick up those desert iguanas there. There they are. There are flats at Cave Buttes. Those are the Union Hills, and there are flats around them that are preserved by the Sonoran Preserve and by Cave Buttes. No desert iguanas. We've been there now for years looking for them. They're not there. Why not? It's clearly not due to disturbance, at least not some obvious disturbance, because that looks like a typical creosote flat to me. If we just come down a bit to the south and to the west, we start picking them up. Those 2 blue stripes there, if you can make them out, I hope. Oh, very good. Okay, that one, that's the Agua Fria River floodplain. That's the New River. So we're just directly west of here. Deer Valley Road, where it crosses those floodplains, sandy floodplain habitat historically. Those black dots are desert iguanas, and you can see superimposed there, I hope, that there's all sorts of housing and developments, McDonald's and so on, and desert iguanas are right in there among them. They do not appear especially susceptible or vulnerable to disturbance. I'm convinced they are not missing from cave buttes because of something we did. They were never there. This is my hypothesis at this point. Because here they are in much of the west of the valley in places that you could say, disturbance-wise, are a nuclear holocaust. Dramatic things have happened and they're just fine. What do I think's going on with desert iguanas? That's their distribution. They're a hot desert species. Here in Phoenix, we're on the northeast edge of their distribution. I think they're simply dropping out as you go from southwest to northeast across the valley. And they're still present where they were, but when we included cave buttes and had flats as part of that preserve plan that we talked to them about, I remember telling them, you'll include desert iguanas if you do this, because I just looked at field guides and said if there's a creosote flat, there's a desert iguana. We found out otherwise when we started sampling. This is just showing, and again, it's a bit difficult for you to make out, but there's a desert iguana happily living out its life in a vacant lot, right? And there's one that's, we crept up to someone's porch and took this picture of it resting under one of their ornamental shrubs, but you get the idea. In this case, we don't think they're absent from those preserves on the northeast side of the valley because of something we did. We think they may just not have ever been present there. So turning that around, in the west side of the valley, West Wing and other such preserves that have been established more recently, if they had included portions of flats adjacent to them, even though they were disturbed, they would have desert iguanas. Okay? We here on the east and northeast side just aren't lucky enough to include them. So now, summing up to this point, we can say, all right, the three major habitats, there's a problem if the mountain preserves are nothing but mountains. And they are, by definition. We didn't know this 50, 60 years ago. It's ideal for chuckwallas, but not for other lizards that require other habitat types. Let's get back to that tree lizard, because this highlights another myth, and this is more of a myth that needs dispelling. Native species are native to their current range. You only have to worry about an introduced species that's taking over some environment that you're concerned about, like, let's say, fountain grass at cave buttes or some such. So there's the tree lizard on the right and the side blotch lizard on the left. Doesn't mean we necessarily have to do anything about it, but it is a useful exercise in understanding the current population range, data that we can gather from these two lizards. So this was what I already jumped the gun and told you about. Cave buttes, roughly 24 square miles if we include all of the Union Hills and all of the washes there. That represents somewhat of a model for what the valley looked like. Okay? 3,500 side blotch lizard sightings. Not a single tree lizard. They aren't there. There's not the vertical habitat. If we put in some walls, they would probably show up, but they're not there. So thinking of that, I just circled it in yellow. Cave buttes as a proxy for what the Phoenix area looked like historically suggests that side blotch lizards are the common little lizard, and that's what we should see all across the Phoenix Valley, not tree lizards. So a number of students, and in fact one student that's even sitting here in the audience, and hopefully I didn't miss all the others who might have showed up, but in any case, I had 12 students participate in independent studies where they would look at the lizards at their house. What an easy study to do, right? You have breakfast, you sit on the porch, and you count the lizards on your wall and wherever else you might see them. What did they see? Nothing but tree lizards. Occasionally a tiger whiptail, the two most common lizards. Then they would go to the nearest mountain preserve. Then they had to get out, and they had to hike around, but it's good for them. They would then document the lizards there. What were they? Side blotch lizards. Some tiger whiptails, occasionally they got lucky and came in and told me how excited they were they'd found a Chuckwalla. But in any case, they were always side blotch lizards. Those 12 pairs, it was universal. Tree lizards in the urban areas, side blotch lizards in the preserves. One final way of looking at it, and this will be, again, somewhat difficult, but we'll make do. This is a very large study, and unfortunately scientific names crop up here. All you need to know is these little columns that are in the urban corridor, the primarily urbanized parts of Phoenix, are representing brown, tan, and that's the tree lizard. So when lizards are sampled at these various sites, which a graduate student conducted this study with our help, he ended up finding that in highly urbanized areas, the only lizard that shows up is the tree lizard. The side-blotched lizard, which is aqua, if you're still able to see this here, they're only on the outlying areas where you're in desert of some sort, preserves. And notice that when that happens, he's picking up more lizards. That's why the pie is more heterogeneous. And we won't get into what those colors mean. But the point is, these three approaches more or less settle the issue. Tree lizards were more than likely, historically, restricted to only the largest riparian corridors where you had a cottonwood willow forest adjacent to the river because of the vertical habitat it provides. And that's, they know what their names are, tree lizards, right? Then in the very largest mountain preserves that have cliff faces, large central boulder fields like South Mountain, like the central part of Piestewa Peak, tree lizards occur there. The side blotch lizards are in the flats adjacent to them. But in any case, what we can now conclude is, whereas you'd say the tree lizard occupies 99% of the valley today, historically it was probably just the reverse. Tree lizards were in maybe 5% of the valley's habitat. Side blotch lizards occupied 95% of it. It's an interesting change, even though we consider them both native lizards, right? We're not worried about what the tree lizard has done. But interestingly, we can think of it in a different way. And just scrolling down, this is another review slide. Tree lizards are urban exploiters, a new kind of label for species that end up doing well with some of the things we do. Unfortunately, there's another one that some of you may be battling like I am. Bark scorpions are now considered urban exploiters. They do quite well in places where we remove their predators, which ironically enough turn out to be primarily other scorpions. But in any case, okay, back to the lizards there. That just recaps. I probably said most all of it. That third point there, some species may have been absent. This is one of those eye-openers where you realize how important natural history information is. How important it is to have people who are going out gathering data on things like bird surveys. The ornithologists have been doing this for decades, hundreds of years, right? But for herps, we often just take it for granted. We read a field guide and we assume a habitat designation applies. And we don't think about subtle differences in range that don't appear obvious. Maybe there's some shift in the soil as you go from southwest to northeast, who knows? But it was a wake-up call for us to realize we can't just assume from a field guide basis what species should be present in a place. We need the historic data. We need to have been there to really settle the issue. Okay. So much for lizards. We've got to move on here a bit. I'm still going to try to shoot for, finishing up by 15 or 20 minutes from now. All right. Desert tortoises. Folks just love them to death. That's part of the problem. But there's a couple of radio-tagged individuals. Back to our little aerial view of the valley. Those are the white tanks on the left, the South Mountain, Sierra Estrella at the bottom, Cave Buttes in the Union Hills to the top, McDowell's and Pinnacle Peak on the upper right. The question mark in the center there is to show that they're virtually absent from the mountain preserves now. We know they were present, and we know there are 2 or 3, literally 2 or 3 hanging on in Piestewa Peak. But largely they're gone. So what's the difference with them and lizards? First, those are the Union Hills. That's the combination of Cave Buttes and the Sonoran Preserve that's there on the left-hand side. Those little red stars are sightings of desert tortoises. It's not as obvious for you all to recognize this, but take my word for it. The first thing is they're not out in the flats here, this open area, but you might initially think, oh great, they're in the hills. They're going to be, picked up by mountain preserve approaches. That is true, but it's also the case that right here, every one of these is in a large wash that runs between these hills. You can find them up on the slopes, but what's critical to them are these caliche formations that are only opened up, excised washes in large washes. We have some in Piestewa Peak, and that's where the tortoises are, that are still there. Lookout Mountain has just the beginning of reasonable caliche formations, and bam, you're into a housing tract. As the wash comes off, the slope of the mountains. So in any case, this shows a couple of females basking in front of their caliche refuges. That one on the right, oh, I'm sorry. She's used that same caliche formation for 4 years, uses it every winter. She also uses it during what tortoises know there are actually 5 seasons every year. They know the summer's divided in 2. The hot, dry, right, May and June, that's actually their most vulnerable time period because it's so hot and it's dry. The monsoon, the other part of summer when it's wet, is a good time for them. They can come out and forage and do whatever they want. These caliche formations are critical to allow them to get out of those thermal, challenges that they would face otherwise. So, tortoises require these large washes. Some of the preserves that were big enough have those. Tortoises are still in South Mountain, for example. But the smaller ones simply don't have enough. But there are other aspects to tortoise behavior that are problematic. And that is, for example, that one on the lower left, they love roads. Up at Cave Buttes, where off-road vehicles ended up establishing all sorts of trails and tracks, if they'd been allowed to persist, I'm confident they would have killed off all of the tortoises there. The tortoises love them. They bask in them, they forage in them, they lay down in them, they come out to drink in them. They think we put the roadways in there for their benefit. They're not stupid. They know it makes it easier to travel from point A to point B. The other thing they do, if you can see that one there, she's next to that, as we call them, APS box. They come into housing areas next to the preserve and have no compunction about doing so. This one is on the actual Cave Buttes Dam. That's about 800 meters across, and she used that dam to cross back and forth repeatedly one spring. So in some days when it was hot, she'd get to just the side of it and she'd duck behind that building to get into the shade. But that's her there on the lower left. So they do not shy away from anthropogenic, artifacts, structures, things that we do to the habitat. And again, you might not be able to see her there in the center, but she's on the face of another dike there at Cave Buttes and uses that for foraging. Final thing is, they are still collected. So I've noticed there, I think, are some game and fish employees here. We'll talk about this more later, but they're the one herp that is still collected by just the naive public, as opposed to herp collectors or black market trade people. This is an aerial depiction of home range from a tortoise at Cave Buttes. And I think you can make out, I have to actually come over here to see it as you are, that these are roads, right, trails. This is that off-road area that was heavily impacted. This is a spillway. You can see that this female crosses those roads. Her home range encompasses a huge number of those trails. She lays her eggs near those trails, which we'll see momentarily is problematic. This is another female. Notice she actually uses the spillway. She overwintered on the spillway for 2 years in a row, just under a little shrub in the middle of that spillway, which basically just looks like a big football field of gravel. Here's this one at this house. The people there know who she is and so on, and they have no problem with her being there, but you get the idea. Their pets might have a different take on her presence and so on. This is, everyone thinks they're cute. It's perhaps understandable why a kid finding one of these would bring it home, but there's a little hatchling. She's not much bigger than a ping pong ball, or he foraging under an ironwood. There it is basking in December during the winter. It comes to the opening of its burrow. Now you're going to have to look very closely, but this is just zoomed out. That's her. I should have gotten back further, but that's one of the roads. So this hatchling is just a few feet from that road. If there were people coming by on their off-road vehicles and so on, I can't imagine that it would last much more than a week or two. All right, so tortoises are very different from the lizards we just spoke of. They have a number of habitat requirements that would require really large preserves. They also more or less require us to get out of the way and leave them alone. At Cave Buttes, so that off-road vehicle activity has been squelched. They now keep it locked up and they aren't allowed to go in there. Turns out to be due to dust issues. Who knew? But it's a federal issue, right? Air quality control. So they locked it down so that people aren't out there generating dust. And of course, I'm just happy they're not out there running over tortoises. There's that 10 to 20% if you're reading ahead. So game and fish folks put out sting operations, set them up, I should say, a tortoise on a road in a relatively rural setting. 10 to 20% of cars stop, somebody hops out and picks it up. They know it's not right and so on, and they weren't really trying to just, bust them and make money off the fines. They just wanted to know, and that's the answer. It's a little unsettling. Most of them knew that they shouldn't do it. And then I've already said that, they're lost from most of the preserves. We have a few in Piestewa. So tortoises are definitely impacted. Now here's one, a bit of a tangent, but I figure it's my duty to talk about it. It's something that we simply think of, we take for granted, and I don't want to offend any of the Phoenix Parks personnel that are here and are in any way, shape, or form responsible for the water catchment that's right down the trail here. But just think about it for a minute. Of course, the reason we put water in places historically in the Southwest is for a real bugaboo, cattle, okay? And that is something that I have a great deal of concerns about. But just think about water, because you can take cattle out of it. Folks that I meet up at Cave Buttes that are well-intended conservationists often ask, well, what can we do for the tortoises? Shouldn't we put in a watering trough or something? It's a desert. These animals are adapted to desert conditions. Putting in water is not what we want to do. We, of course, think of it because we couldn't live here without water, but that's us. And of course, our friends couldn't live here without water, cattle. I sort of put it to you that if they can't live here without water, they shouldn't be here, okay? But in any case, a kangaroo rat, right? You guys all know the story, I assume. How often does that little rodent drink in its 2 years lifespan? Never. What if you bring it into the lab and you follow what they used to tell you had to do to take care of rodents at Cal Berkeley in the 60s? You had to put in a water bottle, you killed them. They don't want water, they can't live with water, and they do without. You get the idea. Okay, but of course that's not true about cattle. We put in cattle, and what do? It turns out because we have to establish permanent tanks, we take the water from the temporary tanks. Toads, it turns out, can smell a permanent tank. You can probably smell a permanent tank. I certainly can. If you've ever been out there, you can tell, there is something noxious about this. But in any case, toads don't want to go to a permanent tank to breed. If they have a choice, they go to a rain-formed pool, which has far fewer predators, it turns out, far fewer noxious chemicals and so on. So it's now been established, various species here in the Southwest, green toads, Sonoran green toads, they do poorly when they go to those rain-formed pools because not as much water collects because half the water went to the permanent tank that made use of the channel that used to lead to the rain-formed pool. You get the idea. Okay. And it's well established that cattle take pristine riparian corridors like those that are shown at the bottom and turn them into open thoroughfares for them to come into the water. Large grazing animals simply don't mix with arid desert environments. The other thing they do is these water catchments, and this is my problem with the one down the trail here. Again, no offense to anyone associated with it. They allow noxious introduced species, which are especially bad for our native frogs, it turns out, to colonize those areas. Bullfrogs and Rio Grande leopard frogs that eat our native leopard frogs can only persist where there are cattle tanks because they need the permanent water. That's what those two are. Of course, it does help with some species, some that are closer to us, some that we like to hunt and shoot and the rest of it. And I have no problem with hunters and the rest of it. But much of our mythology of water being a good thing is tied to cattle and hunting and fishing. Just something to think about. Cattle aren't arid adapted. That's why you have to put in a cattle tank. Did you know you cannot economically pull off a cattle ranch? Well, you can almost not do it without a federal subsidy. But you can't have your cows walking more than a mile to get their daily intake of water, or they won't put on weight. That's how much you have to engineer the landscape. Think of the Sonoran Desert. There are many places where that's not feasible unless you modify it. Now you might ask, what's he talking about cattle for? Is he just going off on a tangent here? The flood control properties were grazed until 2010, and we still see the effects there. So many of the areas have been invaded by grasses, and this is showing a relatively desolate area that was invaded by mesquite and grasses, non-native grasses, after years and years of overgrazing. Okay, so to this point, I've basically talked about those myths, summarized lizards, talked about tortoises, a bit of my own little personal agenda on cattle and water in the Southwest. Let's finish it off here. I think I've got enough time and I'll stop talking for questions. Snakes. that little message there, we really have to get out there and understand the natural history of organisms. We can't make these community-wide assessments without doing it. It means it's really a lot of work. Our 20 to 30 years and we're coming up with more questions than answers, right? What about snakes? Now, these are tables that just show the summary of the species present at a couple of sites in typical Sonoran Desert. West of the White Tanks, Sun Valley Parkway, and south of Phoenix, Mobile, Maricopa Roads. Okay, and those are scientific names of snakes, which the details don't matter. But if you scroll down there, you see that ecological truism in terms of percentage of snakes found out of a sample of 400 or 500. Most were very low, meaning they were rare, and a few were relatively common, not like the lizards where 2 species dominated. But if you look there in the center, one thing is you see the West Phoenix Sonoran Desert and the South Phoenix Sonoran Desert are amazingly similar. Can you see those numbers just crossing from left to right? They're virtually the same. Crotalus cerastes, the sidewinder, it's the dominant snake. But look at the other Crotalus, those are other rattlesnakes, are fairly common as well. In fact, these 3 species make up about 60% of the snakes you see in the typical Sonoran Desert. That's western diamondback at the top, that's a sidewinder on the left, that's a Mojave rattlesnake on the right. Now, I just left up one of the West Phoenix sites with cave buttes where we have a sufficient sample. We don't have a sufficient sample from the other mountain preserves. Why? Snakes don't cooperate like lizards. They don't bask on rocks so you can walk by and count them. They're far more difficult to survey. In any case, look at this. There are a number of zeros. Cave buttes is a depauperate snake community, only about 15 species. Those other 2, if you'd counted them, 20 to 24 different species of snakes. And look at that, Crotalus cerastes, the sidewinder, it's a 0. There aren't any at cave buttes. This brings us back to our friend the desert iguana. Now, you probably already knew this from watching nature shows. What kind of habitat do sidewinders want? They want flats. What kind of flats? Sandy flats. Oh, they turn out to be distributed just like the desert iguana, but they fall out just to the west of Phoenix. You can still get them there and just to the south, but they're not here, not because of disturbance, not because of anything other than historical contingency. We simply don't have the sandy, hot, yes, believe it or not, they want it even hotter than it is here. That's why they're centered around Yuma in their distribution. So we're probably missing sidewinders for that reason at cave buttes. Now, I've reduced the numbers for the cave buttes to just the ones that were present. Again, it's only 15. But now look at this. It's more like those lizard data. 1 species, 60% of the snakes, the western diamondback. Now, that seems so out of line with the other 2 preserves. We can say, yeah, the sidewinder's missing, but should 1 species suddenly jump to that level of dominance? We think it does indicate the effects of grazing and other aspects of our modification of the habitat. There's a couple of males who are, they're fighting. There's nothing sexual about this except for the winner, okay? But here's what diamondbacks do that people don't often recognize. Their triangular head, which you of course assume is for venom glands, I thought you might say to yourself. Remember, you can tell a venomous snake from a non-venom, big triangular head. We actually think they have a triangular head to take big prey, and they do. They take rabbits. What's different about cave buttes relative to many other preserves, or I shouldn't say that, relative to pristine Sonoran Desert? It doesn't have nearly as many of the predatory mammals that it used to. It does still have them, kit foxes, gray foxes, bobcats. It's had 1 mountain lion periodically, but not in the numbers that were historically present. So what does it have more than you can imagine? Rabbits. And we think that the diamondbacks may be responding to that. But again, there's some of this who should be there by historic range, and then you get the idea. It's still a difficult situation to sort out. In fact, cave buttes, as I mentioned, is the only one where we can say much of anything about the snakes. Now, we do know there's a sampling issue, but we also know you don't see snakes in the interior mountain preserves like you should, meaning how you would see them in an undisturbed, completely non-urbanized island, right, of habitat. So we do imagine they've been reduced Okay? But there are some that are missing in Phoenix simply because they've dropped out range-wise. This business with the diamondback and another snake called the coachwhip that's common there at Cave Buttes might be related to shifts in prey abundance. Okay. It's just before 1 o'clock, and I think we're going to wrap it up here. But obviously, if we had our way, we'd have preserves be infinitely large. Preserve everything, of course. And then we would keep more of those species. We may have lost some from the interior, some may never have been present. We can safely say snakes and tortoises are more heavily impacted than lizards. To finish off one more aspect, because I'm giving snakes short shrift here. Snakes, by virtue of how much they move around, which they do typically, have much larger home ranges than lizards. If you have a small preserve like Lookout, eventually most any large snake in its daily wanderings gets off the site and gets run over on a road. It's just what happens with snakes. So that's why it's more problematic for snakes than lizards in small preserves. Okay, and the bottom line there is such as it is. Okay, that is it. I will stop talking and take questions. So the question was about Cave Buttes having had cattle in the past that didn't look all that well tended to. I can't really say. I would meet the rancher and more commonly ranch hands that owned the lease until it was revoked or not renewed, I'm not sure which, in 2010 in the 80s and 90s, but I never had a chance to talk to them. To be honest, to me it looked like any average cattle operation in the Southwest. They often are on a real slim margin, meaning it's tough, even with the federal subsidies, state subsidies, and the rest of it. Certainly any of the cattle that I met out there in the middle of the night were just as frightening as any that were, on some other operation. So I don't know that they were worse off for any particular reason.
But they've been permanently removed?
That is my current understanding, and unless flood control, who more or less controls the lease, changes their mind. Yeah?
Do you know if there's been any work done in Papago Park, the zoo, and the Botanical Garden? Because I recall seeing other lizards besides the ones you described. Did you already say that?
No, I did not. If you saw, Papago Park was one of the places we surveyed, and it turns out, is Tom Gatz here?
Oh, yeah. Tom is here.
Oh, very good, Tom. Sorry, I brushed you off there while I was worried about the computer working. So Tom and I have talked about this since Tom works at the Desert Botanical Garden, and we think that a couple of things have happened. Some of the places like the Desert Botanical Garden and the zoo are in essence these little habitat oases. They of course have vertical habitat out the wazoo, if you will, with all the trees and the rest of it they've brought in, and so on. Some species, like desert spinies, we think, and we put this forth in a paper, or I did with Tom's help, may have actually colonized the Desert Botanic Garden with things that they brought in and then done better there than they would have otherwise. So we think that the zoo and Botanic Garden are special places where you have sort of anomalous findings because they're almost like, the best of both worlds, for both urban exploiters and some of the desert forms, because they do a good job, meaning their little area of desert flats is well tended, but then it's adjacent to this super oasis with all the other stuff going on.
What adjacent super oasis?
Oh, meaning the Desert Botanic Garden itself, with all of the vegetation, all of the buildings, water, and the rest of it. Or for the zoo, it's all the animals and the rest. For example, the zoo has all sorts of snakes that you do not find in the preserves. And when I used to work with keepers there and such, they don't kill them, and so on. So they're tending to those animals in a very different way than any other urban entity. Yeah?
When you were talking about tortoise habitat, you mentioned caliche in washes. Why caliche specifically?
So caliche, for those of you who don't know it, is in essence a geologic phenomenon in the Southwest due to evaporation of water and the retention of calcium carbonate in the upper layer of the soil so that it forms this hard ceiling. If you've had a pool put in and the guy told you, you're paying me $5,000 extra because I hit caliche, you know about it. In any case, the water eventually excises that in some wash, and what it allows is for organisms to dig under it, and it's a hard ceiling that remains intact. So tortoises, we have a tortoise tunnel that is apparently constructed by tortoises. It might be, who knows, decades, hundreds of years old. 5 tortoises at a time are using it. It allows them to have very deep, thermally, inert or, low temperature sites for them to get under there. Otherwise, washes, if it's a rocky substrate, if you hit bedrock, there just isn't the opportunity for these large refuges or caves and so on. And all sorts of animals use them. When we, as herpers, are in some area, when you drop into a wash, you look for caliche to find tortoises, Gila monsters, and diamondbacks. All 3 of them make use of those refuges, plus a host of mammals you find. I forgot to put them in. I have really cute pictures of kit fox and gray fox pups looking out of caliche formation when we're looking in expecting to find a tortoise, for example. So lots of animals use them. Yeah?
I've got a question. Have you looked at any of the effects of ephemeral grazing to Herpetofauna, in particular desert tortoise?
So I have not specifically, for all that I talked down on grazing and grazing impacts, done what you're suggesting, that is to look at grazing impacts on tortoises. But lots of other folks have. And there's no other way to put it than cattle are bad. And cattle are bad for virtually every animal that's been looked at. They're good for themselves and for, the cattle industry, of course. And historically, I know it's one of the 5 C's, and we all grew up here, and a Western myth is one of our most important myths. Perhaps most of us in this room here have left it behind and imagine there could be a new myth to replace it. But it's a tough subject, right? It's things that there are folks that have very strong views about that. And the only thing that I think needs to be established is this notion that water is good is simply a silly myth that we've embraced because it's part and parcel of our ability to live in a desert. But for the rest of those organisms out there, especially herps, reptiles don't drink. Now, tortoises do. They're exceptional in that regard, and they don't go to rain-formed pools. They don't go to, out in the flats, permanent cattle tanks. None of our tortoises do. They do special things to get their water in very small ways so they don't have to travel very far up in these rocky ravines and so on. But in any case, even the amphibians, they don't want to use cattle tanks if they can avoid it. They will when they have to. But we now know it's bad for them as well. It's really the water that's my primary issue. Grazing, you can come and go with, well, there's introduced grasses, we need to control them, we don't want fire, and it becomes more complicated than my little, the negative perspective, hook, line, and sinker. Yeah?
Have you surveyed Spur Cross Preserve and are there tortoises up there?
So Spur Cross, I'm sure, has tortoises at least on the southern edge because they're up there in the boulders and around New River and so on. And they can get up to 4,000 feet. So I'm absolutely certain they're there. But no, the only time I worked in Spur Cross was in the 70s and 80s looking for toads. Unfortunately, it used to have leopard frogs. I hope it still does. Does anyone know if there are still lowland leopard frogs? There were bullfrogs then, and they maybe haven't stuck. But it was a concern of mine back then. That's all I know about it. Yeah?
This is probably pretty obvious, but what will be the effect to the species when they put in the South Mountain Freeway around the southwestern end of South Mountain?
Well, so roads are, like cattle. They're always bad at some level. But you can put up all sorts of mitigation devices these days. The one thing that's a worry about roads with tortoises is, for example, those of you who know Cave Buttes, the area, my site, has been bisected by this new road that divides the South Union Hills from the North Union Hills. We know tortoises, juveniles, it's the kids, not mom and dad. The kids who make these big movements out of where they're from, they disperse, to some new area that they end up calling home. And they cross those valleys. We know they cross valleys like that. It's only a few kilometers wide. Now they may not be able to. That's the problem. You're going to end up with all these preserves. In another couple of 100 years, somebody like me comes along and says, I'm looking at Sullivan's old data or whatever. And now what we're worried about is what happened to the Chuckwallas because they're genetically isolated in every one of these preserves. Sullivan thought they were fine, but he didn't know that once every 50 generations from a Chuckwalla perspective, some little juvenile makes it from lookout to shadow. That's not happening now. That used to happen We know that even chuckwallas do that kind of thing like tortoises. So that's one of the problems. Roads prevent that.
Can you expound just a little bit on why genetic diversity is important?
And so that's just like, inbreeding is bad, which you know from movies and so on. And in general, when you hear things like that, I recall a columnist putting in a call to me once, hey, they've told us we only need 50 bald eagles in the Southwest. If we've got 50, what's the big problem with Southwest bald eagles? Or 50 in Arizona, I can't remember what it was. And 50 is a scary number. It's too small a sample of the gene pool. And you don't need to be a geneticist to know this, but think back to royal families and hemophilia and the probability of some mutation showing up and being a bad thing. In general, outbreeding is good. And in general, numbers much higher than 50 are what a geneticist would tell you you're looking for. So if you hear numbers, I'm just giving you again, like I did for cattle, my 2 cents worth on an appropriate, biologically reasonable perspective. If you hear someone tell you, oh, if we get to 110 wolves, whatever, I'd be leery, I'd be worried. I would much rather hear numbers like, oh, it's for all intents and purposes an infinite population. Okay, I know we can't do that, but that's when you're talking about hundreds of animals, not 50, not 100, not something you can easily count. That's what I use as my yardstick. If you can easily count it, it's too small.